this. Everybody can hear me okay? My voice can get very loud. I've controlled many times. I'm actually going to lower this thing a little bit so I don't overpower it. So, Richard and Roberto, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. As Richard has described, my task is to scare you. Hopefully what I'm going to do is present some information. I'm actually going to start historically and talk to you about how our understanding of these threats have evolved, and it's evolved substantially over what is a pretty short time frame. Then I'm going to talk particularly about the sophisticated threats, and then hopefully I'll start the set of discussions about how to respond. But before I get into the presentation, I'm going to acknowledge that the presentation largely looks at it from a U.S. perspective. And what I wanted to be sure that I started with is what I'm going to describe for you is happening all over the globe. That's known. It's not just targeted at the U.S. as a nation or U.S. companies, but it's happening everywhere. I don't have a lot of specifics about how much it's happening in Costa Rica and Central America, but given the nature of what we observe with certain, actors, both state actors and criminal actors, they are attempting to do this anywhere where they can make money or gain advantage. This is now a tool of competition. And as the businesses and governments here become more dependent on information networks and technology, along with it comes the risk that you're going to suffer from these cyber threats that I'm going to describe. And then again, through the day, hopefully that's a risk you can manage if you're aware of it, and we'll talk about how that happens. So I actually already described this. I'll begin by talking about sort of the historical development, how we understand the nature of the threat, and I would say in the last 5 years or so in the cybersecurity field, we've really changed how we think about these threats, and then what does it take to, in order to defend yourself to the degree possible against these threats. So I have a series of slides here. There's a lot of labels on them. I'm not going to try to describe all of these labels. So I'm going to go relatively quickly because I want to make sure that there's time for the translators to add or step through this in a way that the translators can get everything. And if they would give me some sort of slow down sign if I'm going too fast, that would be very useful. But what I want to do is highlight sort of the evolution of our thinking. So it is important to realize that threats to electronic communications didn't just start with a 13-year-old hacker that Richard described. That as long as we've been using, back to the telegraph, electronic communications, people have been trying to intercept those communications, spy on you, take advantage of that. Even the early telegraph was people would tap that and intercept it. So for the United States, in the Cold War, which I use that term, in the competition primarily with what was the Soviet Union, there was a very robust competition to listen in on each other's communications, and therefore we had to protect ours. One of the things that these slides are set up to do is down here, oops, that's not going to work. Down here, I talk about the nature of the technology that's important during that time period. In the middle, because Richard told me to scare you, I talk about all the different threats. And then over here, I talk about how we came to know what the threat is, how intelligence works. I do. Thank you, Roberto. Let me just try it out. Okay, good. So again, Cold War, we were already in a competition, mostly a nation-state competition related to intercepting communications. Then, the way I described the evolution of cybersecurity was an event called the Morris worm that took down much of the internet connectivity that existed in 1998. And it also started sort of the field of cybersecurity as it focused on the internet. In responding to that, the first computer emergency response team was stood up the year after the Morris worm. And during the decade of from the late 80s to the 90s, we obviously had a massive, change in networking technology. The World Wide Web came about, and this was the period where we were mostly concerned about hackers and hunting hackers. Most of the damaging events turned out to be, in many cases teenagers, or usually young men in their teens or 20s. But it was also a period where we started to watch the evolution of particularly nation states start to try to take advantage of communications that were based on the internet. And then, around the turn of the millennia, we started to see more obvious disruptive events. These events, solar sunrise and moonlight maze, were events that occurred focused on the U.S. Department of Defense. We never figured out who was responsible for this. It was believed to be Russian espionage against Defense Department systems. Here it was an interesting case where it turned out to be an Israeli hacker mentoring two California teenagers, but they got into both the U.S. Air Force and the South Korean Nuclear Agency. And originally it was just the Korean Nuclear Agency, and there were worries about whether the North Korean nuclear facilities have been hacked. And this is way back. This is 15 years ago, in 1998. So this concern about cybersecurity has been there for a while, and basically for the worse, it's been getting worse and worse, as I'm about to describe. But these events, some of you may have heard of, these were the big worms that we called them, code that propagated across the internet, did so fast at times. Banking services were disrupted, telecommunication services were disrupted. This is just a picture of an infection of one of those sets of codes during the course of its propagation. And then we did have attacks against e-commerce sites as early as 2000. There was a series of attacks. Again, it was still in the age of the teenager. A Filipino teenager managed to take down the early services of Amazon and eBay in 2000. So, it is important to realize, the people trying to do bad things have been working on it now for quite a long time, and they have become much more sophisticated. In terms of how we dealt with this, we had the rise of computer emergency response teams. I don't know, maybe I should have looked up. Does Costa Rica have a national computer emergency response team? Does anybody in here? They do? Right, so. And all the national teams globally just met in Bangkok last week. So this is the rise of a community of technical people, sort of first as outside experts and now increasingly within companies. Most of the major global companies now have their own response teams and very dedicated practices, which will get described during the course of the day. So this presentation is designed primarily for a U.S. audience, so I call this a dark age for a lot of reasons, because the attention sort of got distracted after 9/11, and the nation that I was still in the Air Force during this period. Our attention was over here, but we started to see, and this is very important, I think maybe very relevant for this audience, that the growth of what I call an internet underground. There is a very well-financed, mostly through criminal money, set of people that work globally to create infrastructures in order to commit fraud and cybercrime. They also they utilize these this system of computers that would be called a botnet. And if, at a time we could describe exactly what that is, but effectively they take over large numbers of computers, which I remember being worried in like 2003, 2004 about botnets that numbered 10, 20,000 computers. These botnets now number over millions of computers, 2 million, 4 million computers, and they're out there for hire. This underground has become stronger and stronger over the course of a decade, despite the efforts of law enforcement to try to find the people responsible for them and take down botnets. There's a lot of press in the United States about FBI takedowns of botnets. The strength of the internet criminal underground, its sophistication, technically, its ability to conduct fraud and conduct damaging disruptive attacks have grown dramatically and continues to grow despite growing efforts to stop them. Now I'm going to just Global Crossing very quickly is the name of what was a U.S. Fiber optic cable provider that was bought initially. The Chinese wanted to buy Global Crossing, and this highlighted for us in the United States the issue of trying to understand where your technology and who operates it come from. The IT industry tends to be a very global space in terms of who constructs the equipment and often who operates the networks. We became very aware that giving control over those two things to countries in their companies, and in China's case, there's not much of a distinction at times between their industry's connection to their government, that could be very risky and could be taken advantage of, and there's certainly known cases where what's called supply chain risk, where you get your equipment from, is the way that the adversary gets into your systems. So in the last 5 years, 6 years, there's just been a huge rise in attention in cybersecurity in the United States, and then hopefully I think this event is in part about making sure that that's a global phenomenon. Here in Costa Rica, we're doing that. Estonia was a case where the actual nation, its banks, its governments were attacked in 2007 by denial of service attacks from these botnets, and they actually had to cut themselves off from the internet so that they could continue to function because the denial of service attacks were so bad. Similar events have occurred in Korea. RBN stands for the Russian Business Network, which is a highly institutionalized, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars a year criminal enterprise that sells denial of service attacks and tools to conduct these attacks. Night Dragon I'm going to describe as a sophisticated Chinese set of intrusions against the oil and gas industry. And what's important to realize here is this in particular is not national security related. This is criminal fraud, mostly against banks. This is companies supported by governments trying to understand competitive information. And again, I'll get into Night Dragon a little more, but they're stealing business secrets so Chinese businesses can compete more effectively against the people they're getting the information from. So today, I live in Washington, D.C. I do a lot of work with the U.S. national security community, but we also work with the Japanese computer emergency response team. What the level of concern about the events of the last year have risen to the top of what in the United States is considered important, both economic and national security concerns. How many people know what Stuxnet is? That's a good test for me. So not a lot. All right, so it's a good indicator. This is a picture from inside the Iranian nuclear facilities. Stuxnet was a set of code that basically infected the Iranian nuclear reprocessing capabilities and caused damage to the physical processes of trying to extract highly enriched uranium. This has become a major sort of change, and now nation states are launching attacks on the physical infrastructures of their competitors. And basically it's believed in response, the Iranians launched a virus on Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi national oil company, the largest company in the world. And over one weekend, 30,000 computers had their hard drives wiped to nothing. Now, this wasn't in the control systems, but the Aramco guys woke up on a Monday morning with most of their corporate IT network wiped down to zero. It is another huge, incident, and there's a lot of companies are now trying to deal with the fact that they could have target attacks even by a nation state that take out most of their corporate infrastructure. And then over the last, since September of last year, so it's getting on about 9 months, a series of high volume, highly agile denial of service attacks have affected the U.S. banking industry. They really haven't taken the banks down. The banks are working very hard to keep their customer-facing websites and services up, but they have been disrupted. And there is a lot. It's continuing. It's continued for 9 months. These attacks come up. They start from a different place than the last time. So it takes a lot of work to try to sense whether they're coming and stop them. So this has become sort of an environment that is just constantly affected by enterprise-level attacks that are highly disruptive, and it's unfortunately part of a nation-state level competition at times. Though denial of service attacks are used, in industry now to sort of disrupt competitors. Over here, I won't go into this a lot, but the intelligence we have about where threats are occurring has become much more sophisticated in the commercial private industry as well. And APT, I'm going to describe what that term means, Advanced Persistent Threat. A company called Mandiant put out a report about 4 or 5 months ago that detailed in pretty fine granularity who was responsible for a series of, in this case, Chinese espionage attacks. The very specific technical data about what to look for to see if that attack was coming. And this was all done by a commercial, intelligence provider. So that's also different here too, is people have been concerned that all the protective information is in the government, but we've now come to a place where you can learn to protect yourself by getting advice and services from the commercial sector as well. So that hopefully did part of what Richard had intended me to do, which is to talk to you about what these threats are, where they've come from. The next few slides talk particularly about this notion of advanced persistent threat. So in the cybersecurity field, we used to talk about hackers and worms and viruses, and these were relatively, unsophisticated point-by-point challenges, often with individuals or small groups. And this notion of nation states or highly organized criminal groups organizing campaigns that are going to last for the indefinite future to compete with you is a different sort of threat that we now face in cyberspace. And it's not going away. Unfortunately, the number of actors doing this is only increasing. I would say, and I think maybe some others will describe in part, the use of mobile technology and cloud and social media all give more places for this activity to occur. So understanding how this works is, I think, important for you, because the whole cybersecurity community had to shift how we did business away from firewalls and boundary protection into sort of what I'll describe as a campaign to stop different threat actors. Just to realize how important this is, at least in the United States, the president has declared this a national and economic security challenge. Our senior intelligence official has recently declared that cyber security is the #1 threat to the United States. More than terrorism, more than nuclear weapons, that our economic competitiveness is so driven by the fact that these threats can get into our networks and take data, that it has become the #1 security threat to the United States. And I mean, that's not hyperbole. It's on record in testimony to the U.S. Congress that the Director of National Intelligence has declared that. President Obama met with President Xi just a few weeks ago in California. 40% of their dialogue was about cybersecurity, both not having a sort of disruptive conflict between the states, but President Obama trying to make President Xi aware that U.S. business is actually may accept the notion of Congress putting trade sanctions on the Chinese if they don't stop stealing all our intellectual property through cyberspace. I mean, if you think about the U.S. president and the Chinese president spending more time on one topic than any other, and that topic being cybersecurity, that's to me, just a fact that shows how serious it's considered to be, at least in some nations. In the United States, our Defense Department the Secretary of Defense says, we know we can't stop it all. We are going to have attacks that get into our infrastructure. We have to learn to operate with that and get those people out of our infrastructure. And the government works increasingly closely with the private sector. There's definitely challenges there that I think maybe some of the others will talk about. I know David's going to talk a little bit about information sharing. But our corporations have now, particularly in financial services, the defense industrial base, but increasingly in the energy sector and others, are trying to figure out how to deal with these advanced threats. How am I doing on time? When I take a watch on. Richard, how am I doing on time? Okay, good. So, I'm just going to build this slide out. So, where have we been? It was about 6 years ago when we were trying to, I was in the U.S. Air Force, we were trying to work with, in this case, defense industry and describe why cybersecurity is changing. We came up with this term called advanced persistent threat. And this slide, and I won't read all the words on the slide, was an effort to try to make industry people understand, and I think it's probably appropriate with this audience too, about why this is different than what the 13-year-old hacker and why you're going to have to do additional and different things to deal with it. First, they use a very sophisticated tool set. I will say that just because you have an attacker that isn't using sophisticated tools doesn't necessarily mean it's not a highly sophisticated actor, because what they do is use the least sophisticated tools that they need to until they're discovered, and then they up the ante in terms of tool sophistication. When we started to understand that this was happening, we often discovered that the networks that were infected had been intruded upon for years. 2, 3, 4 years before they were discovered, that the actor, whether it was a criminal actor or a state-sponsored espionage actor, had been inside the network, taking data out and achieving their competitive goals for a very extended period of time. Even as, I think recently as last year, Mandiant, this company that now does response to these sorts of threats, basically stated that in 94% of the cases that they responded to, the company and they only do company work, they don't respond to government incidents, the company that they had been working with had been notified by somebody outside that they've been hacked into, which in the United States case was often the FBI and law enforcement, coming to a company, its senior officials or its security officials, and saying, we know from what we can see on the network that you have an actor embedded inside your network, and it's a serious thing, you should work on it, right? And then, again, there's now a set of companies that can be called in to try to help figure out what that is. This persistent term here, I think in terms of how people think about security is the most important part. These are adversaries that are not going to try to hack you once, and if they don't get in, go away, go on to the next easier target, or if they do get in, take some stuff, get out and run, and don't come back. These are adversaries where if you are an oil company, Exxon, and you're constantly exploring for new oil sources, and you are bidding on contracts against a Chinese-sponsored government entity, and again, it's not all about the Chinese, though they are certainly the entity with the largest amount of this activity under their purview right now. But anyways, they are going to be coming after you for the indefinite future. They are constantly going to be searching for whether your network has vulnerabilities. Once they get in, they're going to hide inside your network and maintain what is sometimes called a foothold for as long as they can. And if you're not looking for them inside, they're going to basically be in there indefinitely. And they're going to, in a very sophisticated, slow fashion, extract whatever information they want so they can stay persistent. They're not about smash and grab. They're about getting in and being able to monitor what you're doing for the long term. So which is not the way the cybersecurity field was built. The typical cybersecurity practice builds a castle wall, assumes that if somebody gets in, you have a bad day, you declare an incident, you clean up that incident, you fix the computers, you scrub the computers that were there, and then you're good. And you sort of just put that behind you, and you're back to defending your castle wall. Well, that doesn't work in this case, because the adversary is trying to hide. You may clean up some of your computers, others may not be cleaned up. If he may have left other holes in your castle wall to get into in case he gets found and cleaned up. This is not an incident, one-off event. It's a long-term conflict or a campaign against people that want your information to compete with you, and you have to continue to work on it with that mindset. And then the threat, and I've got a couple other slides on the threat. There's a whole series of types of adversaries that do a variety of different things in order to gain advantage. So Night Dragon, I think a couple of key points. We use this slide to basically make sure that people don't think this is all about stealing defense secrets by adversaries. This was in the this particular series of attacks and tools is pretty well known. So the oil and gas companies should be defending themselves, but they were trying to get into exploration and bid negotiations, and this is a big thing. I mean, we've done work in the mining industry too. Your competitors want to know what your bid's going to look like, and they take advantage of that at the point of winning the contract through the information they get through these exploitations. And the other thing is, it wasn't just in the United States. Companies in all of these countries were affected by the Night Dragon attacks. This just is a little more of a technical slide about how they did it. So again, I won't go through each step, but the key thing is it's a series of events that take place in order for them to eventually exfiltrate sensitive documents and information. And when we're going to talk I'm going to talk a little bit about defense, others will too. What you're trying to do is break their ability to conduct any of these steps, because they actually do need to get all of them to happen to get, in this case, the objective is to take out the documents they need to increase their business competitiveness. In this case down here, it's listed both technical and sort of policy procedural vulnerabilities that most of the oil and gas companies had when they were subjected to these Night Dragon attacks. So as Richard was saying, we didn't want to just scare you, and there are things you can do. In this slide, this is an air defense system, but you can set up a cyber defense system that puts layers of protections in. And because I'm going to describe some more of what we recommend to people about how to think about and do things for defense, I'm going to skip that. So I'm going to try to take about 10 minutes to go through mostly a conceptual perspective. Many of the other speakers will talk more practically about specific tools or services. But as you think about defending your network, against the advanced attacks, these are the things I think are critical. First, you can't put a set of firewalls and fully patched up systems that can't be intruded upon. The U.S. Department of Defense spends $4 billion a year on information assurance. In those systems, they have admitted will never be perfectly defended. So you've got to, figure out who's attacking you, and to me, it's effectively a risk management problem, right? You can spend more on protective measures, you can spend money on responding effectively, you can consider and make sure the technology you're using presents more or less risk and it's more or less hardened. There's a whole series of things that if you know who's attacking you, because financial criminals use different methods and tools than state-sponsored espionage people, and if you're subject to DOS attacks, you need another whole set of tools that you don't need necessarily to deal with cyber fraud. You've got to know who's attacking you so that you can figure out the right tools and approaches to manage the risk. I'll talk a little bit about how you make them go where you want so you can defend. And then one thing I think really goes under-addressed in cybersecurity. With the technology changing so fast, you'll need to stay current with the right set of tools. But the one thing that you have in an organization that hopefully stays for years on end are your people. And training them about how to take care of the problems we're describing and manage this risk is probably the asset you have that's most sustainable and most agile in terms of changing when the threat changes, because it will change. So quickly, this slide, which you guys will all have access to, just describes a whole series of adversaries that could be threatening. One thing I hadn't talked about a lot, and I did that consciously, is the people inside your own enterprise often present the most risk. And this is sort of a cut-down, sanitized version of a threat spectrum we did for a specific company, and we definitely felt like for them, it was their own employees, maybe teamed up with some of these adversaries that really would present the most risk, because they had really good sort of boundary layer defense, and they had a lot of proprietary code because of the way they did business, so it wasn't going to be easy for any hacker to get into their network. But if one of their own people decided to damage them, that was going to be very dangerous. And if you know this field at all, the insider threat creates another whole layer of concerns that you've got to manage pretty aggressively. One thing that we try to lead people through is, if you understand, who might be your attackers, who might take advantage of having your information or disrupting your operations, you can then think about the different ways they attack. We call them threat vectors, DDoS, putting disruptive malware, like in the Shamoon case, inside, how they might actually compromise your system, the traditional technical hacking attack, but also control it so they can stay inside. Then you think about the consequences to you, and then what risk scenarios you have to deal with. So our approach is, in part, to think about these adversaries. What you want to do, and this is particularly for the sort of sophisticated intrusion sets, this isn't the same approach you would use against denial of service attacks, but it's to push the bad guys back as far in the set of actions they need to take. They prepare, they get in, they move within your network and stay in there and try to find the information they want, and then they take action, either disrupt it or take information out. What you're trying to do is push them back as far as possible in their ability to do these things. If you can stop them any time short of them taking action, you've actually successfully defended. And there's there's well-developed methodology. I'm going to just sort of show you a few things that can be done in order to understand these threats and start to fight back. I actually want to avoid that a little bit. There's an active discussion in the United States about whether corporations should actually hack back and actively defend themselves. Leaving that alone, there's a lot of things you can do with your own network and your own operations that would that will allow you to track your adversary and to defend yourself and reduce your risk. So again, I'll leave this for your information. If there's questions later, I'll be here all day. But what I wanted to leave you is the impression that Richard started off with, which is this isn't just something that's really bad. It is something bad that you can do something about. So again, I'm not going to brief this, but one approach that we've worked with people about is track these actors, how active they are at any point in time, what periods historically they've been very dangerous, and just develop a system of activities that allow you to do things that disrupt their operations, which we call counter plays in the methodology that we use. And similarly, if you're going, this is something I think is already started to a degree. When you have a Super Bowl, a World Cup, a World Bank Summit, those become focused times for the adversary to get information out. A merger and acquisition is also something very interested to your commercial competitors. And you can do things because in those focused situations, who are the individuals that are going to get spearfish attacked, which networks hold the information that is most important to a merger and acquisition, or in the case of these events and summits, we now have teams that go in for things like the Olympics and make sure that the networks associated with those things are particularly well protected and monitored, because we know bad people will try to disrupt these events. So we say there's a whole separate set of approaches that can be done to protect key corporate individuals and events. So again, these last few slides just to start the dialogue for today about the fact that while cyberspace is really dangerous now, there are things you can do to protect yourself. I mentioned this before. One of the things that we spend a lot of time on is training and building processes and procedures for the teams, and mostly in companies, though we do some work for the government on training materials, to do all of these things. Analyze, what adversaries are coming at you. Decide quickly on what actions need to be taken. Do the technical work if machines are compromised to figure out what happened to those machines, what data was lost, which adversary. And then I think David from State Street is going to talk a little bit about information sharing. So build trust. You can have all the agreements in the world to share information with each other, but if the people don't trust each other, little happens. So I've mentioned already, I think people and skills are your best, most sustainable, adaptable asset in an area that changes a lot. So the question is, can you build that team? What this is supposed to do is taking your traditional IT geek and changing him into a cyber warrior. That's what the intent of the right set of images is. So it's a little dramatic, but there is a set of skills that the normal IT professional will need in addition to pocket protectors and his normal technical skills. So to finish up here, technology, your choices about what technology to use is going to affect your attack surface. Banking functions going into mobile devices, I can tell you, and Dave will have his own perspective, but there's risk involved there. The security guys know that. Competitiveness drives the need to take on new technologies, even if it's risky. So you've got to understand what you're doing when you use the technology that moves increasingly fast. One thing I haven't talked a lot about, but I think is fundamental, this activity happens globally. Your adversaries are all over the globe. They aren't centered in one nation state. Particularly the criminal activities are very agile and know how to use legal structures to operate in places where it's hardest to get at them. And therefore collaboration is important, international collaboration, but sharing with your peers about what the problems are and what they're seeing. And again, there'll be more to talk about that. And then again, I go back to, I think the most fundamental thing that you can do is understand the nature of the threat, what you're doing that presents risks, and then teaching people, how to manage this problem effectively. So I'll stop with that. I think I'm still within time. And I probably have time for at least a couple questions. Does anybody have a question or a comment? Okay, thank you.